Daniel Harris sat on the edge of his small bed, staring at the message on his phone for the 5th time. It was short and simple, yet strange enough to make him frown. The words read, "You are invited to a blind date this evening. Do not be late. The location will be sent shortly." At first he laughed, thinking it was nothing more than one of his friends trying to play a trick on him. But none of his friends had ever sent him something written in such a formal way. The message had no smiley faces, no jokes, no hint of fun. It felt serious. Daniel was 26 years old, an ordinary young man working long shifts at a repair shop. He did not have much of a social life, and the idea of a blind date almost felt like a dream. His last relationship had ended badly, and since then he had thrown himself into work. So when his phone vibrated again and the location appeared, he felt a strange pull. Told himself it was silly, yet something inside him whispered that he should go. As the evening came, Daniel put on his cleanest shirt, a pair of dark jeans, and his worn shoes polished until they almost shined. He stood before the mirror, brushing his hair back, shaking his head at himself. "This is a mistake," he muttered under his breath. But his legs carried him outside anyway. A black car waited at the end of the street, its windows tinted. The driver stepped out and opened the door without a word. Daniel froze. Every part of him screamed to turn around, but his curiosity was stronger. He climbed inside. The ride was quiet. The car moved through the city, past the glowing lights, until the streets gave way to wide roads that stretched into the hills. Daniel pressed his face against the window, trying to guess where they were going, but the driver said nothing. The silence grew heavy, and Daniel's heart beat faster with each passing mile. Finally, the car stopped in front of a massive structure, unlike anything Daniel had ever seen. It looked like a fortress from another time, with high walls and great towers, but it also glowed with soft lights along its edges. The driver opened the door and gestured for him to step out. Daniel obeyed, his legs unsteady as he followed the path toward the grand entrance. He kept telling himself this was just a date, but deep down he felt that nothing about this was ordinary. Inside the hall, the ceiling stretched high above, painted with patterns that shimmered like stars. Golden chandeliers hung from chains, filling the space with warm light. Long tables lined the sides, but the center was empty, waiting for something. Daniel swallowed hard, his eyes darting across the room until he saw her. A woman stood at the far end, her gown flowing like water, her eyes fixed on him. She was tall and graceful, with long hair that fell in soft waves over her shoulders. Her presence filled the room, commanding and gentle all at once. Daniel stopped in his tracks, unable to believe that she was real. He had expected an awkward dinner with a stranger, not this vision of beauty and power. She raised her hand slightly, and 6 young women stepped forward from behind her. They stood in a line, each one dressed with the same elegance, their faces carrying the same striking features. Daniel's breath caught in his chest. He counted again. 6 daughters. He wanted to laugh, to shout that this was impossible, that someone was surely playing a joke on him. But the silence of the hall made it clear this was no prank. The woman began to walk toward him, her steps slow and graceful. Daniel tried to move, but his feet felt rooted to the ground. His mind raced with questions. Who was she? Why him? What did she want? But when she reached him, she simply looked into his eyes, and in that gaze, Daniel felt the weight of something far greater than a simple date. His heart pounded in his chest, and the world around him seemed to fade. He had walked into this evening expecting a joke. Instead, he had stepped into a story that was only beginning. Daniel stood frozen as the woman in the flowing gown came closer. The sound of her steps echoed gently across the hall. She stopped only a few feet away, and Daniel felt his throat tighten. Her presence was unlike anything he had ever known. She was beautiful, yes, but there was more than beauty. There was strength in her eyes, as if she carried a history of battles and victories no one could count. She smiled faintly, and the smallest curve of her lips sent a shiver through him. "Welcome, Daniel," she said, her voice calm but filled with power. "You accepted the invitation. Few would have been so bold." Daniel's lips parted, but no words came. He could only nod as his mind tried to catch up with what was happening. She knew his name. She had been expecting him. None of this made sense. Behind her, the 6 young women watched him carefully. Each one carried the same sharp eyes and graceful stance as their mother. They were not children, but strong and poised in their own right. One had dark hair that fell straight to her waist. Another had bright golden hair that caught the light like fire. The others, each in their own way, seemed to shine with presence. They wore dresses that looked as if they had been spun from silver threads, yet each detail marked them as warriors ready to act. Daniel wanted to laugh nervously and say it had to be some mistake. He wanted to tell them he was just a simple man from a repair shop, but something inside him told him to stay silent. This was not a place for jokes. It was something far beyond what he had known. The woman lifted her hand, and the daughters stepped back, forming a half circle around Daniel. He felt as if he was standing in the middle of a silent trial. The woman's eyes softened as she spoke again. "You may be wondering why you are here. You were invited because your heart was tested long before this evening. You were chosen not for wealth, not for power, but for the truth you carry within." Daniel swallowed hard, trying to breathe. He had no idea what she meant. Tested. Chosen. These words sounded like they belonged to a story, not his life. Yet here he was, standing in a golden hall, looking into the eyes of a queenly figure and her daughters. One of the daughters stepped forward, her voice clear and steady. "What do you value most in life, Daniel?" She spoke without judgment, as though she truly wanted to know. Daniel blinked, caught off guard. His instinct was to give a clever answer, but the weight of the moment forced honesty out of him. "I value trust," he said quietly. "When people trust you, it means they believe in you. And I think nothing is more important than that." His voice shook a little, but he did not look away. The daughter studied him for a moment, then gave the smallest nod before stepping back. The other came forward, her eyes like clear water. "If you were given power," she asked, "would you use it for yourself or for others?" Daniel drew in a breath. "For others," he said. "I don't need power for myself. But if I had it, I would want it to protect the people I care about." His words hung in the air, and the silence after them made his chest tighten. The daughters exchanged glances, as if his answers mattered more than he could know. The woman watched him quietly, her hands folded in front of her. Finally she spoke. "Courage is not always in battle. Sometimes it is in speaking simple truths. Tonight you have shown me something rare." Daniel felt the weight in her voice press against him. His knees wanted to give way, but he stood firm. Did not understand why he mattered here, but a small voice inside told him he had stepped onto a path he could not turn back from. At that moment, the great doors of the hall swung open with a heavy sound. Guards entered quickly, their faces tense. The leader bowed to the woman and whispered something urgent. Her eyes narrowed, and she turned sharply. The warmth in the hall shifted into tension. She looked back at Daniel. "Your night will not be what you expected. You wished for a simple date, but fate has written another story for you." Her voice was calm, but carried a weight that made his skin prickle. The daughters moved as one, drawing close to their mother, their eyes sharper than before. Daniel stood in the center, his heart pounding. Whatever test he thought this was, it was only the beginning. Daniel felt the tension spread through the air as the great hall shifted from quiet elegance to sharp unease. The guards who had entered carried urgency in their steps, and their whispers to the woman made it clear that something serious was happening outside the walls. Daniel's breath quickened as he looked at her, waiting for an explanation, but none came at first. Instead, the 6 daughters moved closer to her side, their hands resting on the hilts of their blades, as though danger might burst through the doors at any moment. The woman raised her hand, and the guards fell silent. Her eyes swept across the hall before landing back on Daniel. He felt her gaze weigh heavily on him, and then she spoke with steady calm. "There is unrest beyond these walls. A rival seeks to test our strength tonight." Her words echoed with meaning, and though Daniel understood little of the world he had stepped into, he could sense the gravity of her tone. One of the daughters, the one with golden hair, stepped forward. "Mother, let us face them. We are ready." Her voice carried both confidence and fire. Another daughter added quickly, "He should not be here. He is not prepared." She cast a glance at Daniel that was not unkind, but filled with doubt. Daniel's chest tightened. He wanted to argue, to insist he should leave, but he realized his chance to walk away had vanished the moment he stepped through the doors. Something deeper inside him told him that leaving was no longer an option. His feet stayed rooted, even as fear crawled up his spine. The woman studied him closely, then spoke again. "This night began as a test of your heart. Now it will become more. You must show not only words, but action." Daniel's mouth went dry. He had never been in a fight, never stood with swords or guards, but the seriousness in her voice demanded something from him. "No," it did slowly, surprising even himself with the gesture. He did not know what he could offer, but he knew he could not run. The heavy sound of horns blared outside, shaking the walls with their echo. The daughters reacted at once, moving into practiced formation. The great doors of the hall swung open again, and this time the guards shouted of attackers approaching the gates. The fortress was under siege. Daniel's heart pounded as he followed the queen and her daughters into the courtyard. Torches burned brightly, and the night sky above glowed red from distant fires. The air filled with the clash of steel and the cries of men defending the walls. Daniel froze at the sight. This was not a scene from a story or a dream, it was war. One of the daughters turned to him sharply. "Stay close, do not wander." Her voice was stern but not cruel. Daniel nodded quickly, forcing his shaking legs to keep moving. He followed her as the group spread out across the courtyard, each daughter moving with skill and discipline. Daniel could only stare as they fought side by side with the guards, their movements swift and precise. A group of enemies burst through a broken gate, rushing forward with wild cries. Daniel felt panic rise inside him. He had no weapon, no training. He grabbed a fallen shield from the ground and held it up clumsily, bracing himself as the attackers surged. One charged at him with a raised blade, and Daniel barely managed to block with the shield. The impact rattled his bones and fear nearly overwhelmed him, but instinct pushed him to shove back with all his strength. The attacker stumbled, giving a guard the chance to strike him down. Daniel gasped, his chest burning, but there was no time to rest. Another enemy rushed toward the daughters, and without thinking, Daniel threw himself forward, slamming the shield into the man's side. The move was clumsy and unskilled, but it slowed the attacker long enough for one of the daughters to land a decisive blow. She glanced at Daniel, her eyes filled with surprise, then gave a quick nod before turning back to the fight. The chaos around him raged on. Daniel's arms ached, and his body screamed for him to run, but he kept standing his ground. Every time he lifted the shield, every time he pushed forward, he felt a spark of something new inside him. Fear was still there, but courage was beginning to grow alongside it. When the last of the attackers in the courtyard fell, silence swept over the fortress like a wave. The fire still burned, and the air was thick with smoke, but the immediate danger had passed. Daniel stood bent over, his hands gripping the shield, his breath ragged. He could hardly believe he was still standing. The daughters gathered around their mother, their clothes marked with dust and battle, yet their eyes burned with pride. The queen looked at Daniel with calm strength. "You did not flee, you did not hide, you stood." Her words were simple, but they cut deep into him. Daniel lowered the shield slowly, his arms trembling, and looked back at her. He had walked into the night thinking it was a joke. Now, standing in the aftermath of battle, he realized it was something else entirely. He was no longer just a guest. He was part of a story that demanded his courage, and he had given it. Smoke drifted through the courtyard as Daniel tried to catch his breath. His arms ached from holding the shield, his legs felt weak, and his heart still pounded as if it wanted to break free from his chest. Around him, the guards rushed to secure the gates, while others carried the wounded to safety.
Ow.
The night was far from quiet, but the first wave of attackers had been pushed back. Daniel had never felt so alive, yet so unprepared at the same time. The queen walked toward him, her gown torn slightly at the edge from the chaos, but her presence still strong and commanding. Her daughters followed close behind, their faces set in calm determination. She stopped in front of Daniel and looked at him closely, her eyes studying the dirt and sweat that covered his face. "You stood with us when you could have run," she said softly. "That is not something we will forget." Daniel shook his head, trying to steady his breathing. "I only did what anyone would have done." The words slipped out, but even as he said them, he knew they were not true. Most people would have turned and fled. He had stayed, and for reasons he could not explain, it mattered deeply to her. The golden-haired daughter stepped forward and looked at him with a steady gaze. "You fought with no training, no weapon, and yet you helped. That is rare." There was no mockery in her tone, only respect. Daniel felt heat rise to his cheeks as he looked away, embarrassed by her praise. Before he could answer, the sound of horns echoed again in the distance. This time they were deeper, slower, a signal rather than an alarm. Guards rushed to the walls, shouting reports. The attackers were regrouping, gathering their forces for another strike. Daniel felt his stomach twist. He barely survived the first fight. How could he face another? The queen turned to her daughters, speaking quickly. "The enemy will test us again. We must hold the fortress until dawn. The walls must not fall." Her voice carried authority that left no room for doubt. The daughters nodded as one, their expressions steady. They moved to take their positions with a discipline that reminded Daniel of soldiers trained since childhood. Daniel wanted to speak, to tell her he was not ready, that he was just an ordinary man. But as he looked into her eyes, he saw no fear. She believed they could endure the night. Something about her calm strength spread to him, settling the storm inside his chest. He straightened his shoulders and gripped the shield tighter. He was still afraid, but he would not walk away. The night dragged on with waves of noise and silence. Arrows whistled through the air, striking the gates. Stones crashed against the walls. Each attack was met with resistance, each push beaten back with courage. Daniel fought beside the guards, his shield raised, his body aching with exhaustion. Every time he thought he could give no more, he saw the daughters holding the line, their movements graceful but fierce. Their strength pushed him to keep standing. At one point, an enemy soldier slipped through the chaos and rushed toward the queen. Daniel's eyes caught the movement, and without thinking he lunged forward, slamming his shield into the man's chest. The force knocked both of them to the ground, but Daniel scrambled up first, grabbing a fallen spear and driving it into the ground beside the enemy to keep him pinned. The guards dragged the man away, and Daniel staggered back, gasping for air. The queen's eyes met his, and for a moment her calm mask slipped into something warmer, something almost proud. The battle stretched into the late hours. Flames lit the night sky, smoke curled above the walls, and the ground was marked with the scars of endless struggle. Daniel's body screamed for rest, but he stayed. Each strike, each push of his shield, felt like proof that he was no longer just a guest caught in the wrong place. He was part of their defense. When the last wave finally broke and the horns of retreat sounded, silence fell heavy over the fortress. The enemy had pulled back. The gates still stood, the walls still held. The night air was filled with exhaustion, but also relief. Guards cheered weakly, voices rising like sparks into the smoke-filled sky. Daniel stood among them, his chest heaving, his hands trembling around the battered shield. The queen stepped forward, her daughters gathering behind her. She looked at Daniel as though seeing him in a new light. "Tonight you became more than what you were," she said softly. "You have earned a place among us." Daniel lowered his head, unsure how to answer. He had come here expecting nothing but a strange evening. Instead, he had fought for survival, stood beside a queen and her daughters, and discovered strength he never knew he had. As dawn began to rise, painting the sky with soft light, he realized his life would never be the same again. The first rays of dawn broke over the fortress, painting the sky with soft gold. The fires that had burned through the night still smoked, but the air felt lighter. The enemy had been pushed back, and the walls still stood. Daniel leaned against the battered shield that had never left his grip, his body aching in every limb. He had never known such exhaustion, but also never such pride. He had fought, he had endured, and somehow he was still standing. The queen stepped forward, her daughters walking close behind her. Their gowns and armor were marked by battle, their faces tired, but their eyes glowed with quiet strength. She stopped in front of Daniel, studying him with calm and steady eyes. "The night has ended," she said softly, "but what you did will not be forgotten." Daniel lowered his gaze, his voice rough from smoke and fatigue. "I only tried to help. Anyone would have done the same." The words felt empty even as he spoke them. Deep inside he knew it was not true. Many would have run. He had stayed, though fear had clouded him every step of the way. He had faced danger with nothing but courage and instinct. The golden-haired daughter stepped closer, her voice clear despite her exhaustion. "You fought beside us as if you belonged here." Her words carried no doubt, only respect. Another daughter added, "You were untrained, yet you stood when the walls shook. That is not something small." The others nodded, and Daniel felt a strange warmth in his chest. He was an outsider, yet they spoke to him as though he was one of them. The queen reached out, placing her hand gently on the battered shield Daniel held. This shield is not only wood and steel. Tonight it became a symbol. It carried not just your strength, but your heart. You showed courage when there was no reason to believe you could win. That is why you matter now. Her words struck deep into Daniel, and he felt his throat tighten with emotion. For a long moment, silence filled the courtyard. The guards who had fought through the night gathered nearby, their eyes turning toward Daniel. He felt the weight of their stares, not in judgment but in gratitude. He realized he had not only fought for himself but for all of them. His actions had helped hold the walls, and now the survivors looked at him with respect. As the sun rose higher, the queen turned to her daughters. The fortress stands because of many hands, but also because of one man who chose not to leave. We will honor that choice. Her voice carried across the courtyard, and the guards bowed their heads slightly in agreement. Daniel's chest tightened again. He had never sought honor or recognition, but the weight of their respect filled him with something he had never felt before. Later, when the fires were put out and the fortress began to heal, Daniel found himself standing with the queen and her daughters in the great hall. The silence was calmer now, no longer heavy with fear. The queen faced him once more. You came here for a simple meeting, yet fate placed you in the middle of a trial. You proved yourself in ways words cannot measure. You are no longer a visitor here. You have a place among us if you choose it. Daniel's heart pounded at her words. His life before this had been simple, almost empty. Long days of work, quiet nights alone, a future without clear meaning. Now in this hall, with the queen and her daughters before him, he felt something he had never known. Purpose. He had found a reason to stand, to fight, to matter. He lifted his eyes, meeting her gaze. "I will stay," he said simply. The words felt heavy but right. He did not need to think. The choice had already been made in the heat of the battle when he refused to run. The queen gave a small smile, and her daughters exchanged glances of approval. The golden-haired daughter stepped closer and whispered, "Then you are one of us now." The simple statement struck deeper than any praise. As the sun filled the hall with light, Daniel understood his life had changed forever. What began as a blind date had become a story of courage, loyalty, and belonging. He had thought it was a joke, but it was destiny. And now he stood not as a stranger, but as part of a family bound by battle and trust. His ordinary life was gone, replaced by something far greater than he had ever dreamed.